the nightmare of a new order. A Führer, his people, and race. Crimes against humanity. A world of chaos and destruction. This is the story of humanity's darkest hour. The abyss. France, 1940. The German Wehrmacht defeats the French army in just 6 weeks. To humiliate the archenemy, the Nazis put on a special show. German dictator Adolf Hitler orders a railway carriage diverted onto a branch line in the forest of Compiegne. This is where the French will sign their surrender. This is where Germany acknowledged defeat at the end of the First World War.
In modern PR talk, we'd say he staged it really cleverly. He won the hearts of very many Germans. They could now say, yes, good job, we're back, we really showed them.
Adolf Hitler had experienced defeat in the First World War as a devastating blow and a personal insult. According to secret SS reports, victory over France in 1940 is the most inspiring moment Germans have experienced since the outbreak of World War II. Hitler is at the peak of his power.
Well, Nazism is unthinkable without the First World War and without Germany's defeat in the First World War.
That defeat was the jumping-off point for the murderous cataclysm the Nazis would unleash over the decades to come. The First World War between 1914 and 1918 was the first truly global war. It was fought with revolutionary weapons, tanks, machine guns, warplanes, and gas. It was industrialized killing, a 4-year massacre.
It's basically impossible to exaggerate just how devastating the consequences of World War I were for every country that was involved. The loss of life has been extraordinary and utterly unexpected. This would pretty much literally touch every family. So you have to imagine a world in which everyone is grieving. Literally everyone is going to be grieving for someone.
The First World War claimed an estimated 20 million lives, half of them civilians, with a further 21 million wounded. The appalling consequences cannot be ignored. Hundreds of thousands are mutilated.
This war seared itself into people's souls and into their bodies like no war before it. It traumatized hundreds of thousands of soldiers. Post-war, there was the phenomenon of the Shakers, shell-shocked men who no longer had control over their bodies.
Shakers in Germany, shell-shocked in Britain. But it's the same illness. With wartime rationing, diseases like tuberculosis and rickets, often caused by malnutrition, are widespread in Germany. They claim many lives. But Germans put up with the sacrifices because they believed that victory is imminent and inevitable. When the military situation takes a sudden turn for the worse in 1918, the German High Command under Erich Ludendorff and Paul von Hindenburg ask for armistice negotiations. But they don't want to bear the responsibility.
The High Command played a disastrous role. First, they lost the war. Then they acknowledged Germany's defeat too late. Then they did a bunk. And finally, they blamed it all on the Republican elements who took over. And they succeeded. And so the Weimar Republic was disadvantaged from the beginning.
On November the 11th, 1918, the German Empire and the Western powers of Great Britain and France agree a ceasefire in a railway carriage in Compiegne. No German generals are present. Instead, a politician, Matthias Erzberger, signs the ceasefire. He's a civilian, a member of the Catholic Centre Party, and a Democrat. Peace at last after 4 years of slaughter. The terrible shared experience seems for a moment to bring people together, at the front, and above all in the victorious nations. But at home, the Germans are stunned and bewildered. The army and the press have been lying to the people for years, concealing the dire situation.
There hadn't been any air raids, all the fighting was outside the country. And if you looked at the German newspapers in September 1918, many said we were winning. So for very many people, the defeat was a total shock.
Large numbers of soldiers come back to Germany, convinced they were undefeated in the field. What will happen to them? What will happen to their country? Nothing is clear. And that goes for a returning soldier called Adolf Hitler, an Austrian artist and drifter who moved to Munich in 1913 and volunteered for the Bavarian army in World War I.
The First World War matters for Adolf Hitler first and foremost in order to explain his own politicization, radicalization. There is a delayed impact of the First World War for him because he returns from the war with still fluctuating political ideas. He still hasn't quite realized that Germany really has lost the war. And it is really only in the summer of 1919 that Hitler fully realized that the war has not ended in some kind of draw, but that Germany really has lost the war.
The defeat will soon be political fuel for the Nazis. 1918, Germany in the throes of revolution. Kaiser Wilhelm goes into exile in the Netherlands. Communists want to establish the rule of the workers. Liberals and Social Democrats plan to transform Germany into a republic. On November the 9th, 1918, Social Democrat Philipp Scheidemann acts.
Arbeit und Soldat, das Alte und Morsche, die Monarchie ist zusammengebrochen. Es lebe das Neue, es lebe die Deutsche Republik.
After the war, democracies are established in Austria, in Hungary, in Poland, Czechoslovakia, and the Baltic. Most will survive for just a few years. In Russia, the Bolshevists are fighting their way to power in a brutal civil war. Their communist utopia of equality and justice finds supporters all over the world. And it unleashes fear, especially among the middle classes.
The Russian Revolution is a cataclysmic event, and not just for Russia, but for other European countries, including Germany. Many people in Germany, especially in the middle classes, but also on the extreme right, are afraid that the revolution will come to them.
These are not groundless fears. Just 2 hours after Philipp Scheidemann proclaims German democracy, communist Karl Liebknecht declares Germany a socialist republic. Hatred poisons political discourse. A widely distributed leaflet demands, "Kill Liebknecht."
The tone of political confrontation in the Weimar Republic was extraordinarily violent from the beginning, and in those confrontations in the 1920s, the word annihilation was meant entirely literally.
To stop the socialist revolution, the Social Democrat Party forms an alliance with the army and the right-wing Freikorps militia. The aim is to defend democracy, but at the same time it strengthens the enemies of democracy on the right. On January the 15th, 1919, rightist militias murder the 2 communist leaders Karl Liebknecht and Rosa Luxemburg.
The extremes radicalized one another after the First World War, and the rise of the communists had the added advantage for the Nazis that communism was already the bogeyman of the German middle classes. And so communism helped National Socialism to form an alliance with the conservative forces of the middle classes.
Germany is a powder keg as nationalist groups gather. They're heavily armed and prepared for violence.
There were many different groups in the nationalist camp. What they had in common was radical opposition to liberal democracy, their embrace of violence in support of their aims, and the fact that former frontline soldiers played an important role in them. But the radical right suffered by being full of self-appointed leaders who would often rather fight each other than combine to target their real political opponents.
In Munich, the German Workers' Party has a new member, Adolf Hitler. In 1920, the year it becomes the National Socialist German Workers' Party, the NSDAP, Hitler's fanaticism attracts attention. In 1921, he compares the movement with the ministry of Jesus Christ.
We may be small, but once a man stood up in Galilee, and today his teachings rule the entire world.
In 1920, the NSDAP has just 1,700 members. In 1921, Hitler takes over as leader. By the end of 1922, membership has multiplied tenfold to 20,000. But the Nazis are still only an extremist splinter group.
Soon it was clear that this party had no distracting internal leadership disputes. That was a great advantage as far as its effectiveness was concerned.
Former Freikorps militant Ernst Rohm is responsible for the party's increasing use of violence. In 1931, he becomes leader of the notorious SA, the Stormtroopers. By the time the Nazis seize power, the SA will have murdered hundreds of people.
Ernst Rohm plays a central role, especially in the early stages of the party's growth. The SA is certainly typical of a new style of politics that would have been unthinkable before 1914. It was a militarization of political life.
The brutalization of politics is a problem in many countries. But Germany's Nazis will take violence and murder to a level the world has never seen before. Could that have been foreseen at the very beginning of the Weimar Republic?
In November 1918, history was not yet written. It wasn't obvious Hitler would take power, that there would be a Second World War, that Auschwitz would happen. The Weimar Republic had its chance.
In January 1919, Germans elect the National Constitutional Assembly, the first parliament of the Weimar Republic. For the first time, men under 25 and women have the vote.
There is record participation. Germans are hungry for democracy. They want to be involved.
The SPD Social Democrats win the election with 37.9% of the vote. The Catholic Centre Party comes next with 20%. The left liberal DDP gets 18.5%. The DNVP, the German National People's Party, a loose coalition of conservatives, anti-Semites and monarchists, reaches just 10%. SPD politician Friedrich Ebert becomes Reich President. His party colleague Philipp Scheidemann, Reich Chancellor. Democrats are in control.
The 1919 election was deceptive because it produced a three-quarters majority for the forces of the Republic. But over the 1920s, this majority showed itself to be unstable.
The Palace of Versailles near Paris will become the symbol of Germany's destabilization. In January 1919, the victorious powers begin negotiating the peace treaty that will formally end the Great War. The Germans do not take part in the negotiations. They are only allowed to make written submissions. It soon becomes clear, as the defeated power, Germany must accept harsh terms. Chancellor Philipp Scheidemann is appalled. Any hand would surely wither that would bind itself and all of us in such chains. He resigns even before the negotiations are over. Versailles is not about reconciliation, but about punishment.
The French in particular wanted to hold up to the German people their moral guilt for this war, for all its destruction and its annihilation. On their way to the negotiations, the train carrying the German delegation rolled especially slowly past the battlefields to sear the sight onto the Germans' eyes. In Versailles, they made the German delegation sit opposite French veterans with mutilated faces to remind the Germans of their moral guilt.
The victorious powers want to avenge what the Kaiser and his armies wrought. But they're punishing the new German Republic and weakening its young democracy.
They didn't want to give defeated Germany a democracy bonus. Defeated Germany was now a republic and had adopted one of the most democratic constitutions in the world. But it was to be given no leeway.
Bekam keine mildernden Umstände.
The Allies write into the treaty that Germany shall lose all its colonies and 1/7 of its surface area. That means that around 10% of its population will now be living outside Germany's borders. In addition, Germany must pay reparations at a level still to be defined, and Germany will bear the entire guilt for the war. The draft treaty unleashes furious protests in a country that is already unstable.
Demobilized men, revolutionary uproar, right and left fighting each other, a whole new political system being introduced, and national defeat, humiliation. After that, the terms of the Treaty of Versailles, the extent of reparations, all of this was horrendous for Germany.
And right-wing nationalists use opposition to the Versailles Treaty to advance their own ends.
Versailles gave birth to a politics of revanchisme and resentment in Germany with horrific consequences. The question is not whether the makers of the Versailles Treaty caused the Nazi crimes or were responsible or guilty for the Nazi crimes. That's not the question. The question is whether they contributed to the creation of an environment that made it possible for creatures like Hitler to flourish. By that measure, Versailles was a terrible, terrible failure.
For years, Hitler attacks the despised Versailles diktat. He knows he's hit a nerve. Take this speech in November 1933 in Berlin.
Man muss Besiegten auch wirtschaftlich vernichten, damit es dem Sieger wirtschaftlich besser geht. Eine irrsinnige These, die aber den ganzen Versailler Vertrag wie ein roter Faden durchzieht. Man versucht die Wirtschaft eines großen Volkes, mit unerträglichen Lasten zu beladen.
The Nazis encourage the feelings of many Germans that they're victims, using targeted lies. November 1919. The Parliamentary Commission of Inquiry into War Guilt invites Field Marshal Paul von Hindenburg to testify. He claims that the revolution on the home front undermined the army, the famous legend that the soldiers had been stabbed in the back. It made pacifists, leftists, and Jews responsible for Germany's defeat. It was a lie with far-reaching consequences.
In the 1920s, the stab-in-the-back myth quickly developed into a crucial weapon of the right, because through it, the revolution and Weimar democracy itself could be tainted with the odium of betrayal. And that narrative of betrayal is absolutely central.
Right-wing newspapers spread that myth. Many Germans are only too happy to believe the fantasy of an army undefeated in the field. They don't know that Hindenburg himself had demanded peace negotiations in 1918 because the military situation was hopeless. One senior officer does his best to tell the truth. In 1922, General Berthold Deimling makes a well-publicized speech.
The German people should stop giving credence to this myth. The guilty men are those who failed to call for a negotiated peace while there was still time.
In retirement since the end of the war, Deimling has turned from a hawk into a critic of the military and a member of the left-liberal German Democratic Party. Many former comrades now turn their backs on him, especially when he directly blames the Army High Command for losing the war. In the person of Paul von Hindenburg.
Hindenburg was a legend. He was virtually an alternative Kaiser. The real emperor was gone, but people wanted a new father figure, and attacking him was unthinkable for those on the center-right. That's why the voices for a more nuanced view, for the truth, if you will, couldn't make themselves heard. The problem of the stab-in-the-back legend was this: it splits society.
And it strengthens the forces of nationalism. The conviction that they have been betrayed by treasonous leftists, Jews, or Democrats fans their hatred for the Republic.
These extreme ultra-right nationalist movements thought that the democratic system was undermining Germany. There was too much pacifism, too much regret about the loss of life, they needed to toughen up. So you have these new far-right movements coming in, and very, very violent as well.
There is violence, divisiveness, and hatred. In its very first year, democracy is already in a critical condition. And yet at the same time, the Weimar Republic is beginning to show its potential. The economy is growing. Unions are negotiating higher pay and shorter hours. Old role models are breaking down. The number of women in employment increases from 500,000 in 1907 to close to 1.5 million in 1925.
The 20s is very, very interesting because women get the vote and women can become politically active. And it's an extraordinary image as well in Weimar culture, women with short hairstyles and women smoking and women doing everything they want. So it's a fantastic image. It's supported very much in certain left-wing circles.
The social upheaval can also be sensed in the nightlife. After years of misery, many want to enjoy themselves. Moral boundaries are shifting, especially in big cities like Berlin.
It would be a mistake to identify the Weimar Republic totally with the modernization of culture that was happening in some urban areas. At this time, Germany is still very much a rural society and still very religious. So we shouldn't be too surprised that these attempts at modernization in urban centers were seen as going too far. And pretty soon they met with resistance.
City dwellers are still in the minority. Approximately 80% of Germans live in small towns or in the country, a world away from the roaring 20s. Here, ideas of tradition, of a supposed German identity, of blood and soil, win support. A counter-movement to big city life. It's the illusion of purity.
The Germans were in such a depressed state after the First World War, and so oppressed and so dishonored by the imposition of the Versailles Diktat, or at least that's how they felt. They'd had to go through the whole mess of the collapse of the empire.
Diesen ganzen Schlamassel des untergegangenen Kaiserreiches hatten ertragen müssen.
So it was wonderful to be told, things may be tough, but you are a master race. You have the best genes in the world. You are the ultimate race. That must be nurtured and preserved. They loved hearing that.
At that time, the German race was a perfectly natural concept to most Germans. And to many Germans, Jews could not be part of it. Hatred for the Jews had a long tradition in Germany, as in the whole of Christian Europe. Radical anti-Semites picked up on old prejudices and took them to extremes, none more than Adolf Hitler. In 1920, in Munich's Hofbräuhaus, he fires up an audience of 2,000, attacking the Jews as parasites, destroying the health of the nation. A Munich newspaper describes him as the shrewdest, most astute rabble-rouser currently stirring up trouble in Munich. In a letter written a year earlier, Hitler had expressed even more extreme views. The final goal of anti-Semitism, he wrote, must irrevocably be the removal of the Jews.
Anti-Semitism is the one field I can think of where Hitler in private is even more extreme than in public. Hitler says in between around 1920, 1921 and 1923, he says a few times that ultimately all Jews ultimately should be killed. And he says, well, once we're in power, we'll round up the Jews of Munich and we'll hang the first ones off the gallows on Marienplatz in the central square in Munich, and we'll let them hang there until they stink. Then we'll cut them off and we'll hang the next bunch of Jews. And we do the same thing in every German market square in Germany until not a single Jew is left.
At the beginning of the 1920s, about 1% of Germany's population are Jewish. Many see themselves first and foremost as German, not Jewish. At that time, Germany was not considered a country unusually prejudiced against Jews.
This was quite different from the situation in many Eastern European countries. If you think about it, the pogroms, the violence against Jews in Eastern Europe in the late 19th, early 20th century had been much more vicious than anything that had been known in Germany.
At the beginning of the 20th century in the Russian Empire, right up to the revolution, there were pogroms against Jews. An estimated 50,000 Jews were killed in nationalist pogroms in Ukraine alone. In 1920, Hungary passed an anti-Jewish law to limit the numbers of Jewish students. The mania of anti-Semitism is inflamed by the leading role played by Jews in communist movements. Leon Trotsky in Russia, Béla Kun in Hungary. In Germany, Kurt Eisner and Rosa Luxemburg.
It is a perception that's fostered by people on the right that there is this link between Jewishness and communism, and so the Nazis in particular start using this term Judeo-Bolshevism, and this is perhaps the main thing that Hitler says he is against and that he is fighting.
In fact, most of Europe's Jews have little sympathy for communists. In the Weimar Republic, German Jews have their first opportunity to rise to high public office.
The full emancipation of German Jews in the Weimar Republic is used by its detractors as proof that Germany is now run by Jews.
Walter Rathenau is a Jew, and since 1922, he's German foreign minister. Right-wing hatred of the Republic can now be combined with hatred of the Jews. Anti-Semitic beliefs are stoked by lies like the forged Protocols of the Elders of Zion, a pamphlet written at the end of the 19th century that is supposed to prove the Jewish goal of world domination.
The Protocols of the Elders of Zion had a remarkable effect in the West, and especially in Germany, because they put in words what people were feeling. The Jewish Satan, this conspiracy. Rabbis planning the Jewish conspiracy for global domination. It existed, and it hit a nerve.
And in Germany, anti-Semites also claimed that Jews shirked their duty to fight for the fatherland. In fact, almost 100,000 German Jews fought in the First World War, 10,000 of them as volunteers, in exactly the same proportions as non-Jews. One of the Kaiser's Jewish soldiers is Lieutenant Hugo Gutmann. He recommends one of his men for the Iron Cross. The soldier's name is Adolf Hitler.
The story of Hugo Gutmann really matters for Hitler because he needs to write the story of Hugo Gutmann in his life out of the story, because all evidence suggests that there was no tension between Hitler and his Jewish commanding officer at the end of the First World War.
Gutmann is a threat to the Nazis' carefully cultivated claim that Hitler had always hated the Jews and suffered under them. In 1937, Hugo Gutmann is arrested by the Gestapo. He's freed, and in 1940, he can flee to the USA. There, he changes his name to Henry G. Grant, not least out of fear that Hitler's henchmen could track him down and kill him.
It really helped Adolf Hitler that once Hugo Gutmann had arrived in exile in America, he didn't really want to talk about the past anymore.
In 1962, Hugo Gutmann died in the USA at the age of 81, under the name of Henry G. Grant. Other contemporaries were only too aware of the growing hatred against the Jews. In 1922, a satirical novel appeared in Vienna called The City Without Jews. It was written by Hugo Bettauer, himself a Jew who had converted to Christianity. 2 years later, the book was filmed. This prophetic story takes place in a city called Utopia, clearly modeled on Vienna. The Jews here are blamed for everything bad: moral collapse, inflation, unemployment. The city's political boss banishes the Jews. The demagogue is fated as a hero, but the film ends differently from the reality a few years later. Without Jews, the economic and cultural life of Utopia declines. The anti-Semites acknowledge their error and invite the Jews back. They all live happy ever after, only in the movie. Author Hugo Bettauer is known for his liberal views. He campaigns for modernized divorce laws, the right to abortion, and the legalization of homosexuality.
To the radical right, Hugo Bettauer is everything they despise. And I think you have to realize that at this time, the radical right is not yet strong enough for public confrontations. Instead, their policy is to use assassination to eliminate individuals who personify everything they reject.
In 1925, Hugo Bettauer is shot dead by an Austrian dental technician. The murderer had recently joined the NSDAP. Hatred of the Jews is becoming ever more central to Nazi ideology.
National Socialist anti-Semitism was far more than just classic scapegoating. No, it had a cohesive racial theory behind it that consciously led to the conclusion that the Jews must be eliminated. That was Hitler's goal.
The Nazis are taking up dangerous ideas that are already widespread elsewhere, and not just in Germany. In the USA, the Ku Klux Klan is the personification of racism. It preaches hatred and violence against blacks, Jews, Catholics, and communists. At the beginning of the 1920s, the Klan has over 3 million members.
KKK was associated in particular with lynchings, and especially lynchings of black defendants accused of having made sexual advances to white women. It has to be said that lynch justice of this kind, that is extra-legal killings, have a long history in the United States. They long predated the Ku Klux Klan.
The concept of superior and inferior races has been growing since the beginning of the 20th century, with the help of theories of eugenics, of hereditary genetic health. Supporters call for the elimination of supposedly worthless sections of society through selective breeding, sterilization, or euthanasia. Proponents of this pseudo-science include future British Prime Ministers Winston Churchill and Neville Chamberlain before him. The author D.H. Lawrence wrote in 1908, "If I had my way, I would build a lethal chamber as big as the Crystal Palace, and lead in gently all the sick, the halt, and the lamed, and they would smile me a weary thanks."
The ideas of eugenics were very widespread in the world in the late 19th and early 20th century. The US stood out primarily in its eagerness, willingness, and capacity to introduce eugenic policies into law. That was what was exceptional about the United States. Among other things, among other practices, American law introduced forced sterilization.
In Germany, too, the ideas of the eugenicists catch on. Notably in a polemic published in 1920 by psychiatrist Alfred Hoche and criminologist Karl Binding, titled Approving the Elimination of Life Unworthy of Life. Forced sterilizations, experiments on humans, mass murder of allegedly inferior peoples, all these will be radically implemented by Hitler and the Nazis.
Again and again, we see National Socialism picking up on ideas like eugenics or racism, or the idea of the folk, ideas that were already widespread in Germany and Europe at the beginning of the 20th century. But they made them far more radical, pushed them to the limit.
Extreme racists, anti-Semites and anti-democrats are still a minority in early 1920s Germany. They're allowed to express their beliefs openly. Few realize what is coming. In March 1920, 5,000 Freikorps militiamen march on Berlin to install a military dictatorship. They're led by a civil servant, Wolfgang Kapp, and a general, Walter von Lüttwitz. The putsch fails. The violence continues.
Besides that, there was political terrorism. There were secret organizations that set out to assassinate key figures of the Weimar Republic. Public enemy number one for the right was a Catholic politician, Matthias Erzberger, because he had signed the armistice in Compiegne in 1918.
In August 1921, Matthias Erzberger is shot dead while out walking by two right-wing extremists. Murder as a political weapon. The radical right targeting Democrats.
To the extent that we can understand the motivation of these extreme right-wing terror groups, it was as if they simply had to murder these people because of the way they were corrupting Germany. If you go around singing, "Cut down that Walter Rathenau, this godforsaken Jewish sow," that isn't just a slogan. For many, that's a call to action.
In June 1922, German Foreign Minister Walter Rathenau is shot dead by members of the extreme right-wing Consul organization. Rathenau's death is deliberately falsified with fake news. In an interview with Britain's Daily Express, Field Marshal Ludendorff insists Rathenau was murdered by communists. It's an outright lie, but a lot of people are willing to believe the real enemy is on the left. Both the police and the justice system treat the enemies of democracy on the right with leniency and understanding.
When you look at political assassinations and left and right-wing violence, the courts are much more well-disposed towards violence on the right than on the left. They punish violence on the left very severely. They're extremely lenient when it comes to murders and political assassinations and violence on the right. There may have been a political revolution in 1918 with the switch to a republic, the end of the imperial system, but there hadn't really been a social and economic revolution, and so the old elites remain pretty much where they were, and the judiciary in particular remains conservative, nationalist, right-wing.
Emil Julius Gumbel, a mathematician and pacifist, found that right-wing extremists committed 354 murders between 1919 and 1922. Left-wingers killed 22. Of the rightist murders, 326 went unpunished, compared to 4 of those on the left. German justice seems not blindfold, but blind in one eye. The beneficiary is the NSDAP, still a small party. The Nazis now want to reach out to new constituencies and broaden their appeal in the largely royalist middle classes. A charismatic war hero could be their entree. Hermann Göring.
Leute wie Göring waren für die NSDAP von einer ganz enormen Bedeutung.
People like Göring were hugely important to the NSDAP. Towards the end of the 1920s, Göring, as a well-connected war hero, helped infiltrate the ranks of wealthy middle-class nationalists and to overcome their initial reserve. I don't think we should get involved with these hooligans.
His fame as a wartime fighter pilot and his complete lack of scruples will propel Göring to wealth and power in Hitler's slipstream. Meanwhile, the Nazis learn from the enemies of democracy abroad, especially in Italy. (1919). Even though it was on the winning side in the war, Italy is suffering from poverty, unemployment, and rioting. Though Italy gained parts of South Tyrol from defeated Austria, the Allies rejected Rome's other territorial demands. Victory in World War I is the Vittoria Mutilata, the crippled victory. The country sees itself as a victim of the peace of 1919. The same year, nationalist paramilitary groups, the Fasci di Combattimento, begin mounting brutal attacks on political adversaries, trade unionists, socialists, and liberals. A former socialist, Benito Mussolini, becomes their leader. He calls himself Il Duce, Führer in German.
To many members of Italy's conservative and middle classes, fascism seems a bold new movement. They see Mussolini as a strong man, a visionary, who can create a new social order using authoritarian methods.
The Italian government finances the fascists to combat the increasing chaos and to preempt the feared Red Revolution. By 1922, Mussolini wants more. He leads tens of thousands of fascists from all corners of Italy in the March on Rome. Mussolini threatens a coup d'etat, but makes it clear he's ready to negotiate.
He's playing a double game, using legal methods to come to power while threatening to unleash terror.
Italy's king bypasses parliament and appoints Mussolini prime minister. His is the first radical right-wing populist party to take power in Europe. In 1922, his party already has 220,000 members. Margherita Sarfatti is one of fascism's earliest supporters. For many years, she's Mussolini's trusted advisor and his lover. A former socialist herself, she writes the first biography of Mussolini in 1926, playing a major role in making the Duce a new kind of political star.
Sarfatti played a very significant role in fascism, particularly in its early days. As a very cultivated and intellectual woman, she could give fascism a veneer of bourgeois respectability, and she established contacts with an artistic milieu. She transformed a somewhat provincial Mussolini into a much more sophisticated figure. So she was very important for Mussolini's own intellectual development, but also in creating the cultural basis for the whole fascist movement.
Margherita Sarfatti is Jewish. At the beginning of Italian fascism, antisemitism plays only a minor role. But by the 1930s, Sarfati senses that the fascists' hatred of Jews is growing.
It's the beginning of a period when Sarfati struggled to maintain her position both as a woman and as a Jew, in the party and in fascist social circles. And in the 1930s, Mussolini begins to distance himself from her more and more.
In 1938, Margarita Sarfati emigrates to South America, only returning in 1947. Until her death in 1961, she insists that the original ideas of fascism were betrayed. One reason for her flight from Italy? In 1938, her ex-lover introduces anti-Semitic race laws. The Nazis in Germany keep a close eye on the rise of the fascists. As early as 1922, Hitler declares,
"For now we shall look up to the fascists and admire them. Soon we shall show them that we intend to carry out actions of a quite different nature."
Where the Italian influence really is in the belief that it's possible to go for power, and also for the kind of the representation of power, of how to mobilize people. In other words, for staging a takeover, and on the level of tactics and operations, the Italian case is absolutely important.
Hitler and the Nazis draw their own conclusions from all of this. The slide into the abyss has begun. But there will still be chances to avert disaster.